It did not look dangerous from the edge of the tree line. In the early morning, with the mist still low over the Norman grass, it looked like any of the thousands of fields that covered this part of France, bounded by hedgerows, sloping gently toward the far side, quiet in the way that places are quiet before something happens in them. But the soldiers at the tree line knew what the field contained. They had been told. The intelligence had come back from a patrol the night before, and it had confirmed what experience had already suggested. There was a machine gun position on the far side, dug into the hedgerow base, with a clear line of fire across the entire open ground. 200 metres. In most circumstances, not a long distance at all. In this circumstance, it was everything. To cross that field on foot, in daylight, against a prepared machine gun position, was to enter a calculation that the mathematics of early 1944 had already solved in brutal terms. The beaten zone of a machine gun covers the open ground completely. A man walking takes many seconds to cross 200 metres. Those seconds are more than enough. The casualties in an unsupported infantry assault across open ground against a prepared position were not acceptable losses. They were, in a very real sense, predictable ones. And the infantry of Normandy crossed fields like this one, over and over for weeks that became months, paying a price in men that ground formations down to fractions of their starting strength. There had to be another way. The answer, when it came, did not arrive from a design bureau or a military planning department or a technical specification written by someone in an office far from the hedgerows. It arrived from necessity, from the kind of thinking that happens when people who are actually dealing with a problem look at what they have available and ask a different question. The question was not, how do we build a better armoured personnel carrier? That vehicle did not yet exist in the right numbers or the right form for the right places. The question was, what do we already have that we can make into one? The Normandy campaign had exposed something that everyone involved already understood at some level, but that the fighting made impossible to ignore. The gap between armour and infantry was killing people. The tactical logic was not complicated. Tanks advancing into defended positions attracted fire and suppressed defenders. Infantry following tanks used the suppression and the physical presence of the armour to close with positions that would otherwise be impossible to approach. But infantry on foot could not keep pace with tanks moving across contested ground. The gap opened, and in that gap, defenders recovered, regained their composure, and engaged the infantry before they could exploit what the tanks had done. The infantry needed to be protected during movement, not fighting from vehicles arriving in them. Getting from the edge of one hedgerow to the edge of another without crossing the open ground on foot, in formation, under fire, and losing half the platoon in the process. Trucks could carry soldiers, but trucks could not follow tanks across the ground that tanks had to cross. They were road-bound, they were soft-skinned, and a truck full of soldiers that encountered machine gun fire or artillery fragments stopped being a carrier and became a catastrophe. Half-tracks offered some protection, but they were not always available in the right numbers, and their protection had limits in the specific conditions of the Norman battlefield. What was available, in considerable numbers, was armour. Old armour, redundant armour whose original purpose had been superseded by the changing demands of the campaign. Self-propelled artillery pieces that had been replaced by newer equipment, tanks whose chassis were still sound, but whose weapons were no longer required for their original role. Armoured hulls that were sitting in rear areas, their turrets and guns representing capabilities the battle no longer needed in that form. Someone looked at those hulls and saw something different from what they had been. The conversion was, in its physical mechanics, almost shockingly simple. Remove the turret, remove the gun, clear the interior. What you had left was an armoured box, tracked, protected against small arms and shell fragments, capable of moving across the same terrain as the tanks it would accompany, with interior space where soldiers could sit or crouch. It was not sophisticated. It was not elegant. It had been designed to do something entirely different, and the modifications made to convert it to its new purpose were done in the field, with the tools and materials available, by people working under time pressure. The ram tank, a Canadian-built vehicle whose combat role had been superseded, provided one of the primary sources for these conversions. The American-built M7 Priest self-propelled gun, when stripped of its artillery piece and converted for personnel carrying, became another version of the same concept. These were among the most common platforms for what became known, informally and then officially as the Kangaroo. The name suited the vehicle's function in a way that more formal designations rarely achieved. A kangaroo carried its young in a pouch, protected and mobile, until the moment came to release them. The Kangaroo APC carried its infantry in its armoured interior, protected and mobile, until the moment came to put them on the ground. The logic of the conversion deserves careful examination, because it illuminates something fundamental about how military capability actually develops in wartime. The turret of a tank represents a significant portion of its weight, its mechanical complexity, and the resources required to maintain it. Removing it created space and reduced weight, but the critical protection remained. The hull armour that had been designed to keep a tank crew alive in armoured combat was the same armour that now stood between an infantry section and the machine gun fire crossing the field they needed to cross. The armour did not know it had been repurposed. It simply continued to do what armour does. What the infantry inside experienced was a specific and disorienting combination of sensations. The noise of a tracked vehicle in motion, transmitted directly through the hull, was significant, a constant mechanical roar that made communication inside the vehicle difficult without effort. The smell of exhaust and hot metal and the particular atmosphere that develops inside a sealed metal space under the French summer sun was not pleasant. The visibility from inside was minimal. You could hear the battle around you, but you could not see it, which produced its own form of stress in soldiers who had been trained to read the ground in front of them. And yet every soldier who rode in a kangaroo across ground that they would otherwise have crossed on foot understood, with complete clarity, what the armour was doing for them. The fragments that pinged against the outside of the hull were the fragments that were not inside the hull. The machine gun fire that swept the field they were crossing was sweeping a field that they were not walking across. The 200 metres that would have cost a platoon a third of its strength to cross on foot was passing beneath the tracks of a vehicle that kept moving. The fear was real. The discomfort was real. The preference for the inside of the kangaroo over the outside of it was absolute. The trade-offs of the conversion were real and required honest understanding. The kangaroo was not a fighting vehicle. Removing the turret had created capacity, but had also removed the primary weapon system. The vehicle could protect its passengers during movement. It could not fight for them once they were there. The infantry still had to dismount and do the work of clearing the position, the hedgerow, the building, the trench. The kangaroo delivered them to that work. It did not perform it. The vehicle also retained the vulnerabilities of any armoured hull. A direct hit from an anti-tank weapon at appropriate range could defeat the protection. A mine under the tracks could disable the vehicle at the worst possible moment. The open top, some conversions retained partial overhead cover. Others did not, left the infantry inside, exposed to plunging fire, airburst artillery, and close-range grenades in ways that a fully enclosed vehicle would have prevented. This meant that tactics mattered. The Kangaroo was not a solution to the infantry protection problem in all circumstances. It was a solution in specific circumstances. Movement across ground where the threat was predominantly small arms, fire and artillery fragments, at a distance and tempo that made dismounting at the objective tactically viable. A Kangaroo driven directly into a defended position without tank support and infantry planning was not a survival tool. It was a target. The commanders and crews who used Kangaroos effectively understood these limits and planned around them. The vehicle's value was not inherent in its armour. It was inherent in how the armour was used. The driver of a Kangaroo in the Normandy fighting occupied one of the more demanding positions in the armoured force. Without a turret, the vehicle's forward visibility was primarily through the driver's periscopes and vision ports, adequate in open terrain, genuinely limiting in the close country of the bocage. A hedgerow corner required committing to a direction without being certain what was on the other side of it. A rubble-strewn village street demanded navigation through obstacles that the vehicle's width did not always comfortably accommodate. The driver operated under a specific form of stress that combined the general stress of being in an armoured vehicle under fire with the particular stress of being responsible for the lives of the people sitting behind him, people who could not see what he was navigating, who depended entirely on his judgment about speed and route and the moment to stop, who would dismount into a situation whose nature they had experienced entirely through noise and motion. If you're finding this story compelling, the improvisation under pressure, the unglamorous problem-solving that shaped the campaign, consider subscribing. There's more to come on the vehicles, decisions and doctrine that defined the Second World War. Navigation in the bocage was not a matter of following roads. The sunken lanes that connected fields were narrow, often just wide enough for a tracked vehicle, and flanked by the same earthen hedgerow walls that provided the defenders their cover. Moving a Kangaroo through this terrain at speed, in formation with tanks and other vehicles, under intermittent fire, required the kind of skill that could not be trained in theory. It was acquired through practice, through mistakes that the armour survived, and through the accumulated experience of a crew that had learned their vehicle's dimensions and limitations the way a craftsman learns their tools. The crews who developed this competence were not celebrated in the way that tank commanders leading charges were celebrated. They were the people who got the infantry there. The work was not glamorous. Its results were measured not in dramatic moments, but in the soldiers who walked away from objectives they would not have reached in the same numbers or the same condition without the vehicle that had carried them. Let us follow a section of infantry through the approach that the Kangaroo made possible. The soldiers loading into the vehicle at the assembly area did not look forward to the experience. The interior was cramped in the way that space is designed for machinery. Rather than people at always cramped angles and protrusions that had been irrelevant when the space was occupied by mechanical systems were now obstacles for bodies wearing equipment and carrying weapons. Finding a position that was tolerable for the duration of the approach required negotiation with the space and with the other soldiers sharing it. Then the vehicle moved, and the world contracted to the sounds transmitted through the hull. The engine, the tracks, the external sounds of the battle filtering through the armour as muffled, percussive echoes close enough to be understood, distant enough to be processed without the immediate physical response that proximity to unprotected fire provoked. The soldiers inside could not see the field they were crossing. They could not see the hedgerow ahead or the smoke or the machine gun position that the tanks were engaging. They could hear the tanks. They could feel the ground through the hull. They were in the battle and insulated from it simultaneously. The vehicle stopped. The side opened, or the ramp came down, or the soldiers climbed over the hull, depending on the specific conversion and the specific moment, and they were on the ground, in cover, at the edge of the objective, with the tanks still firing, with the defenders still suppressed, with the timing that made the difference between an assault that succeeded and one that stalled. They were there, intact, in formation, ready. The 200 meters was behind them. The cost of crossing it was not measured in the men who hadn't made it across. It was measured in the fuel in the Kangaroo's tank and the wear on its tracks. The infantry could fight the position with the strength they had started with, rather than the strength they had left after crossing open ground under fire. The accounts from after-action reports and unit histories of this period describe, in the restrained language of military documentation, the tactical effect of protected infantry delivery on the tempo and success rate of assaults. The language is measured. What it describes is straightforward. Units that arrived at the objective intact, in formation, with momentum, were units that could exploit what the armour had achieved. Units that arrived depleted and disorganised often could not. From the perspective of the defenders, the Kangaroo represented a specific kind of problem. A defensive position is designed around assumptions. One of the most fundamental assumptions in a prepared defensive position covering open ground was that infantry attacking across that ground would be vulnerable during the approach, that the machine guns and mortars covering the open area would thin the assault force before it reached the objective, that the soldiers who arrived would be fewer, more fatigued, and less organised than they had been when they started. This was not a hope. It was a calculation built into the defensive architecture. Accounts from German defensive units in Normandy describe the disruption that protected infantry delivery created in this calculation. The defenders engaged the approaching vehicles with the weapons available to them. Anti-tank fire, where it could be brought to bear, was effective against the Kangaroos. But the vehicles that survived the approach delivered their infantry in the condition that the defensive position had not been prepared to receive, not the thinned, disorganised assault force that the crossing of open ground was supposed to produce, but something closer to the full-strength unit that had loaded at the start line. The frustration was practical, not abstract. A defensive position that had been calculated to absorb a depleted assault sometimes found itself facing one that had not been depleted in the way the calculation assumed. The margin of survival in a prepared defensive position is often thinner than it appears from the outside. Changing the condition in which the assault force arrived could change the outcome of the engagement. The scale at which Kangaroos were produced and used reflected their practical value in a way that no specification or evaluation could have predicted. The concept, born from necessity in the fields of Normandy, expanded rapidly. The conversions continued. Units that had experienced the tactical effect of protected infantry delivery requested more Kangaroos. Formation commanders who had watched assaults succeed that should by prior experience have been more costly began to incorporate the vehicles into their planning as a standard element rather than an improvised one. The advance from Normandy into Belgium, the Netherlands, and ultimately Germany sustained the demand. The terrain changed less bocage, more urban, more open, but the fundamental problem remained: getting infantry from the start line to the objective, through ground covered by fire. The Kangaroo's answer to that problem did not depend on the specific characteristics of Norman hedgerow country. It depended on the physics of armour, the mathematics of crossing open ground, and the tactical reality that infantry who arrived intact fought better than infantry who had been worn down getting there. The vehicle that had been created by removing something by subtraction rather than addition, by repurposing rather than designing, had become a standard capability in the armies that had improvised it. Not because someone had planned it that way, because the battlefield had made its requirements known and the people dealing with those requirements had found a way to meet them with what was available. There is a lesson in the Kangaroo's story that extends beyond the tactical history of 1944. The instinct in military procurement, as in many forms of complex problem-solving, is to build toward the ideal solution to define the requirement, design to that requirement, and produce the result. This is not wrong. It is how most of the equipment that fought the Second World War came to exist. But the Kangaroo came to exist differently. It came to exist because people working on a specific problem with specific constraints in a specific time looked at what they had and asked what else it could be. The answer they found was not the ideal solution. It was the available solution, shaped by necessity into something that worked well enough to matter and that worked well enough to change the course of the campaign in ways that a designed vehicle, arriving later and in smaller numbers, might not have. The decisive 200 metres of the Normandy campaign were not crossed by the most sophisticated vehicles. They were crossed by vehicles that had been made adequate for the specific purpose, by the specific people who needed them at the specific moment the need was felt. The turret that had been removed to create the Kangaroo was not a loss. It was the creation of a different kind of capability, one that the designers of the original vehicle had never imagined, and that the soldiers who rode in its absence trusted with their lives. Wars are not won in design bureaus. They are often decided in the gap between the equipment that was planned and the problem that actually arrived. The gap between those two things is where improvisation lives, and where the people willing to ask different questions about available resources sometimes find answers that change everything. The Kangaroo was a gutted vehicle, a tank with the most important part removed, a box made of armour plate, tracked, noisy, cramped, and reeking of exhaust. And it was, for the infantry who rode in it across the fields of Normandy, the most valuable vehicle on the battlefield. Not because of what it had, because of what it did. It got them there.